I'm going to talk about Fanstatic, which is a byproduct of Zope, Zope 2, Zope 3. And I have a lot of slides. Is it on? Cool. I'm going to talk about what was before Fanstatic, what is Fanstatic now, and... Ah, sorry. Shall I do? Yeah. Cool. So the past, present, and future of Fanstatic. Fanstatic does... oh, sorry. First about me. I used Plone for the very first time in 2004. And that was also the last time I used Plone. I installed it and I never used it again. I'm more a grok/Zope 3 enthusiast. And Fanstatic came out of that movement. I work for Mind District, which is a company that makes online mental health applications. We are hiring both contractors and personnel. First, the past of Fanstatic. Before I used Fanstatic, I used to, and you all did, when you needed some CSS or some JavaScript from somebody else or from stuff you built yourself, you had to cobble it together and download it from SourceForge or GitHub nowadays. You had to make sure that you had to inject it in your HTML at some point, saying, hey, I have this JavaScript and it depends on this other JavaScript, or I have this CSS that needs to come before the other CSS in the browser. You would have to write all these things by hand. I would have links and I would have script tags, and I would have to manage all the dependencies. For instance, I have an example in a few slides. Serving the resources is always a pain because you would have to make a publicly accessible directory of some sorts, or you would need to go through serve your resources through Zope, which would take a lot of effort. Your application server would do that, or you would have to configure your Nginx or your Apache to serve a specific directory of the file system, and you have to sync those. You would have to give up a thread, and threads are expensive, especially in Zope 3, if you have authentication and a transaction being opened for your request if you're not careful. And we came to, or you would have to do it on your front-end server. For example, I have my email validator, which is some jQuery that looks at a specific field, and it does a certain function. It adds something to the DOM or whatever. I would do this. I would manually do this in the head. I would say first find me jQuery and then find me my email validator JavaScript. The result would be a lot of lag work. So you would be thinking, oh, I need to synchronize these files with my whatever. I would have some stuff in my layout template and some stuff in my specific widget, which I would have to cobble up. And the most easy thing would just to put a lot of stuff in your head section of your HTML document, and then you would have too much resources. So not only the resources of the current page you're looking at, but also all the other resources of the rest of your application. And they could interfere, but they would definitely make your application a lot slower. Then the present, I'm talking 2008, because that's basically when 2009, when we started working on this. Wouldn't it be cool? First, we shift a lot of work to the front end. I see myself writing more and more JavaScript and less Python these days. So it would be nice if we could take the tools that we're accustomed to in the Python environment and also use that for front-end code. Wouldn't it be cool if we would treat our JavaScript and our CSS and some of our images as components? So not just regular files, but components that have, for instance, you could easily install these from some location and not just put them somewhere in your project, but your other files also need them, so you now have them twice in your deployment or on your file system. Wouldn't it be nice to have dependency management, saying I have a JavaScript that depends on jQuery, for instance? Would it be nice to collect those and only inject the resources into your page, only the ones you really need for that specific page? The injection process also could use some love, because nowadays there's other ways of injecting your JavaScript to easier or faster load it into the application. And then serving the resources, could we also fix that? because there is some stuff to be had as well. Well, what we did with Fanstatic, we made some widely used things available as packages on the Python package index. You may recognize them from the JS prefix. We kind of hijacked that namespace, sorry for that. There's about 80 right now, so all the TinyMCE, jQuery, Backbone, underscore, you can just easy install those. They do dependency management. So for instance, sorry, one back. jQuery UI depends on jQuery, and my project depends on jQuery UI, so I automatically get all the dependencies that I need. If you install those, they will communicate to each other through setup tools entry points. So there's a global registry, not to be confused with something like the Zope component registry, but basically just a dict of all the packages you will be using to serve in your application. It looks a little bit like this. So if I say I have my own resource definition, I have a library called my package, and it points to somewhere on the file system a directory called resources, and I define a resource saying you are from this library. Your file name is my email validator.js, and you depend on jQuery, and jQuery in this is a resource. This could also be depending on TinyMCE or depending on other available things. You could easily install these dependencies or use pip. So in your setup UI of your own package, you would say, I need these dependencies. Go, go, go. Oh, you would then, this works, cool. Collect those resources during the rendering of your page, saying I have an email validator field, and I have a TinyMCE widget, and I have some CSS that I need in order to render this page. What we do during the rendering of the page, we collect all those resources, and that works a little bit like this. Say I have an email widget that could be, I'm familiar with Zope Formlib, maybe you use C3C Form or something else, saying I have a widget that does my email field. In the widget rendering, somewhere in the update or in the call, and then you say, I need this resource. And it then gets a little registry is bound to your request. In that little registry, this my email validator resource is registered. And then over the process of the request, more than one resources or none could be needed. Then I can inject those into the HTML, but first I need to calculate the dependencies and also the order of the dependencies. So jQuery needs to go at the top and then my other resource, but say I have other resources as well. Martijn and I had some very long discussions about how to sort two trees that don't necessarily depend on each other, long story. I could inject this into the head saying, hey, this is what happens. It's just a regex that replaces the head tag. But then I could also say, I need these in the bottom. So I have the flexibility of putting my resources somewhere. And that is pretty valuable to me, at least. You could also say, I would just want to include the resource as is. So the plain CSS or the plain JavaScript into the head tag if you want to have minimal dependencies. So for instance, if you want only one page, you could do that if you really want it. It's not in Fanstatic right now because we didn't work on it. Then we're going to serve these resources because we know the names of where they are, we know the library names, and we know the resource names, and we have this global registry. We can handle requests, and we do that through the library registry, and we're offloading this off of your application server. So first, a while ago, you would say in Zope 3, I have a directory resource or resource directory, I never know the exact name. That would serve these things off the file system. It would open a transaction, it would check your request for a principal, oh, it's a public thing, but a lot would happen. What if you put this somewhere earlier in your stack, for instance, using WSGI? Then you would have more threads available to open SODB connections, which is pretty cool. So, hey, there we go. That's my entire show. Yes. Wow, this really doesn't work, this VPN over mobile. Sorry. let's just stick with this for now. Am I still in the way? So your application gathers the resources that it needs to render this specific page. Then there's an injector that injects everything into the page, and then, come on, kidding me. Then there's a publisher that can publish these resources. Come on. All of this is now Zope free, as we call it. There's no dependency in Zope interface that was there before. The only dependency is WebOp, which is if you're doing something with WSGI, you better use WebOp. But it has some very deep roots. zc.resourcelibrary is, I believe, 2006. zc.resource did something with hashing and smart things in serving resources. And hurry.resource is a package that Martijn wrote in a hurry, and is basically one of the first things that Fanstatic came from. It now works in grok /Zope 3, Pyramid, Django, and WebCore, which is another thing I never heard about. With some integration packages, because you need to do some stuff, like for instance, if you render an error page, then you need to throw away the resources that were needed until that point, and then say, I'm going to start with a clear registry, and then start needing resources again for my error page. That's basically the only integration thing you need to do. But that's not it. We got some bonus points because we know more about resources and we know more about library names. We can do modes, for instance. I can have a debug or a minified mode, and I can say I now want to render only, or I want to render the debug mode of my JavaScript. Or I want to render the minified mode of my JavaScript, which makes it a lot faster in the browser. For instance, I would say, this is actually from js.jquery. I have a minified jquery.min.js, and it will be served for production mode. Renders are also pretty cool. You could, oh, this is illegible, sorry. I can say I want this resource to be rendered as a media style sheet for print. And then I don't need to manually do stuff anymore, so less legwork. And I just say, I have a resource which is called printlayout.css, and I have a different renderer which will render it as a media print type style sheet. It will be rendered as such without me having to do much about it. We do some smart things with caching, especially with regards to the difference between development and production, where in development you want to have the most recent version of your resource, and in production you want to cache it forever. So what you can do is, for instance, this. Is it legible? If jQuery was released as version 1.6.1, it will be rendered with a version marker in the URL. And if my package is under development, we inject the MD5 hash of the contents or the timestamp of the local access. So this URL will be unique for the version of my email validator that I'm working on right now, which is pretty nifty. So you never have to talk to your clients anymore saying you need to refresh your browser cache in order to make this get a new resource. Another cool thing is bundling, where you want to serve multiple resources in one go. For instance, if I have another resource, which is my password helper, which would say your password is wrong, and it will be from the same resource library, we could bundle those requests into one. So the URL actually looks like this. Fanstatic, my package, bundle, my email validator, and my password helper. So these two would be, this URL would be generated by the injector and handled by the publisher. And there's no manual compile step where you need to figure out, oh, for this page, I want these and these and these resources to be bundled into one. Fanstatic will handle that for you as a configuration option. There's no link between the injector and the application anymore. There's no unique path being rendered somewhere in a temp there where then later you will find this resource, because we handle all the information that is necessary for the bundling in the URL. One thing with regards to bundling is if you have relative paths in your CSS, and you would just concatenate the CSS files without taking into account that these CSS files may be in subdirectories, stuff breaks. So that's why we don't do like very aggressive bundling. So we don't put all the resources in one file, but we could do that for JavaScript. Static offloading is also a cool thing. I can point my injector to say, have all the resources that the URLs to resources that you're going to inject point at a static server, so the browser can download these files in one go. As a result, we now have less legwork. My JavaScript, I can focus on writing JavaScript and not on getting all that stuff into one page. There's less errors in the differences between pages and between developer machines and between production machines, which is really cool. We have more flexibility. As you saw, we can point the rendering of the URLs to certain different locations and also render those in different places in the result HTML. And if you look at the performance guidelines by Yahoo for writing fast web pages, a lot of stuff that you saw in the 5 bonus points is already in there. So bundling and caching headers, expiry headers, stuff like that, and offloading your resources. The future of Fanstatic is that we want to work on a non-Python bound Fanstatic, because a few years ago there was no such thing as a Python package index for JavaScript files. There was no peer, there was no nothing. Nowadays there's NPM, the Node Package Manager, and Ender, which is a Node Package Manager little sister, they call it, for front-end resources. Twitter has been doing something called Bower. I don't know if you've heard of it, which aims to be something like this, like a central repository for JavaScript and CSS resources. And also there's the require.js/AMD people have a structure for defining your resources and defining the dependencies between resources, which is called common.js or require.js. I always forget the exact name, but I want to look into that because it's not so nice to have all these JavaScript stuff on the Python package index. So it would be cooler if they would come from a different source. And also all the legwork that we did to get jQuery onto the PyPI would be cool if we could do without that. And also the AMD way of requiring a resource in your JavaScript, and then JavaScript will find out where to download it, would be really cool to work with that as well. There's alternative loaders such as Head.js, Lab.js, and AMD, which are very worthwhile looking into. Then there's processors such as SAS and Compass and Less that we want to look into in order to make working with those a breeze as well. So what we will basically do, we're working on a branch right now and it's not finished yet, is say I write some SAS and then Fanstatic makes sure that the JS ends up in my browser, and I don't care how, as long as it's the most recent version, just do it. What I want to work on as well is to have a clear distinction between production and deployment, where in production you want to have all these compiler backends available, and in production you don't want to have all these things on your live servers. So no compilation on live servers would be one of the points. Python 3 support is forthcoming, and the question is, could you, if you really wanted to, use this in Plone? Because I don't know much about Plone. I only yesterday found out that WSGI is not the way to deploy Plone. You could do it, but you don't necessarily have to. But as we saw in the web assets lightning talk yesterday, there is definitely some gains to be had from offloading your resources to a simpler web server. So if anybody wants to talk about that, I'll be happy to help out making that work. That's about the end of it. Do you have any questions?
Actually, the integration of Fanstatic.
You did it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
Just I haven't packaged all the Plone resources as
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
I mean, it's working just, but the actual question
Oh.
is, we have all these dependency and everything.
Mm-hmm.
What's frustrating for me when I'm writing JavaScript is that in each package, I have to, if I want to run tests, unit tests, right? I have to kind of pull in all the right dependencies for the test, and I have to copy them and ship them with the tests. So I kind of create this queue unit, put all the includes. Would it be possible to kind of have this test runner or Fanstatic to kind of run the test and include the right versions of the dependency used in production as well?
Sure.
Because, for example, in test I'm using jQuery 1.8, it's the latest, but in, I don't know, clone we are still using 1.64. Yeah, so it's kind of, you can break a lot of stuff. Like the tests are passing, but it's not working.
So are you talking about running tests of JavaScript code or
JavaScript code?
Right, so what kind of JavaScript test one are you using?
Well, right now, Buster, right?
Buster,
Before I was
okay.
using QUnit. It's
Okay,
just like
yeah,
getting
yeah.
the right resources,
Yeah.
like the versions that I'm using in production should be used also for the test.
So are you going to be here in the sprint?
Yeah.
Some of us are going to work on improving Buster stuff, so maybe we should talk.
Yeah. I mean,
But why are you using a different version of jQuery in your production than in your development? Is one of my questions.
Yeah, because at the time, I mean, the problem is because this package is used in clone, the current clone version uses 1.4. Deco version actually upgrades this to 1.7. In the development version, we are trying to push things to use 1.8.
All right.
So, which one to use? Right? I would like to test against all three, right? That would be perfect.
One of the solutions would be to have a JS.jQuery package that would also list the older versions, because you now can only install one JS.jQuery version. But what we could do is say JS.jQuery 1.8.2 also has a file called jQuery.1.6, and you could need that, and then you would still only need the installation. But it's a little bit, it's tricky to have, tricky or maybe impossible to have two versions of JS.jQuery in your Python runtime. So we could try to find a solution for that, definitely.
If you put it on a different variable and you just swap out the variable, or would
Well, I mean, the problem is that we couple the jQuery versions to the Python package version, so you need to install two versions of the same Python package, and that's not really doable.
Anybody else? I guess that's it.
do you minify? Like bundle? Or
No.
No.
We're working on that.
And if you have a minified version, you can tell, I mean, as he said, you can tell Fanstatic about it, and then you can automatically use it.
Yeah, but if you would automatically have the minified version if you go production, and you don't have to have minify.
We are
now
working.
keeps calling that compressors, which is very confusing. You should have written minifiers. We've had this debate like 5 times.
Oh, I thought you said you called it compressors.
No, you've been calling it compressors. Yeah, it should be calling minifiers because that's the word everybody understands. So
okay.
we're working on this compiler stuff, and one aspect of compilation could be minification as well, to do that automatically.
Another question, because it's like this minification, right? It's actually could be also performance hit, right? Because if you minify with some minifier and with some other, you get different performance.
True.
Would be nice to kind of catch the performance-wise, like at least somehow. That's why I like Fanstatic, because you can provide the minified version, right? Because, for example, I just trust jQuery guys that they will minify it the best way they can.
There's certain minifiers that break your code. That's true. And what the idea is that you define for your resource, use this minifier, or at the library level, say use minifier Google Closure or YY compressor or JSMin or whatever the new thing is. And not to use one minifier for all your resources, because that could break definitely if you're minifying other people's code. So if you want to work on that, that would be cool, if you have some ideas. Sure. I don't know how we are for time. We're a little bit early. That's it, actually.